All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this Saturday afternoon. My name is Janie, and I'm with Eastwind Books of Berkeley. So Eastwind Books of Berkeley has been around since 1982, and we're located in downtown Berkeley and has been serving as a community cornerstone for Asian American and ethnic studies literature. So today we are excited to be working with the Oakland Asian Cultural Center to bring you this wonderful book talk with the Auntie Sewing Squad. So with that, I'll pass it on to Akemi.
Right, thank you so much, Janie, and good afternoon, everyone. It's so lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us and bearing with us as we had to pivot to a virtual format for this time. Just a little bit about me. My name is Akemi Chan Imai. I'm the program manager at the Oakland Asian Cultural Center. And our mission really is to build vibrant communities through Asian Pacific Islander arts and cultural programs that foster intergenerational and cross-cultural dialogue, understanding, collaboration, and social justice. And we are very excited to partner with Eastwind for today, and shout out to their amazing staff who are supporting the Zoom tech today. So before we move on, I did want to offer a land acknowledgement. Although today's event is virtual, OACC is based in the San Francisco Bay Area. So we would like to acknowledge the legacy and presence of the indigenous peoples who have and continue to steward this land. And we want to invite people to use this Native Lands website as a starting point to learn about whose land you are living on. So this land acknowledgement that I'm going to share was provided by Canyon Sayers Roots. She is a member of the Costanoan, Ohlone, and Chumash people, and she and her mother, tribal chairwoman Anne-Marie Sayers, are involved in the preservation of Indian Canyon to provide it as a space for all indigenous peoples who are in need of land for ceremony. We are in Huichin. The first language spoken on these lands is Chochenyo. We are gathered on the traditional lands of those whom we know today as the Ohlone people. Ohlone territory spans from San Francisco east towards Oakland and south towards Monterey. 8 language dialects exist within this territory, and historically there are over 60 village sites. It is important that we recognize the original stewards of the territory. We pay our respect to elders, both past and present. We acknowledge that not only are we on their lands, but that they are still here and part of the community. There are 3 active indigenous community groups that have ancestry to this territory, and they are Confederated Villages of Lishan, Himran of Ohlone, Bay Miwok, and Plains Miwok, and Wekma tribe. And if anyone's interested in learning more about Canyon Sayers Roots and her work, just posting up some links for her. And now, without further ado, I would love to hand off to our co-facilitators for today with a short introduction. First, for Chrissy E. Lau is an assistant professor of history at California State University, Monterey Bay. She teaches and researches 20th century US history, Asian American history, women's history, and public history. She is a sewing auntie in the Auntie Sewing Squad. So great to have you, Chrissy. And joining her will be Preeti Sharma. Preeti Sharma is an assistant professor of American Studies at California State University, Long Beach. She explores feminist theories of work, racialized and gendered labor, women of color, feminism/queer of color critique, work centers and alternative labor organizations, and Asian American studies. So very excited to hand it off to 2 phenomenal individuals today. Take it away.
All right. Thank you all so much for having us today for this lovely virtual book event with members of the Auntie Sewing Squad. I'll start off by saying that we're all absolutely excited to be here to celebrate both the Auntie Sewing Squad itself as an organization with all of its struggles and triumphs in this seemingly never-ending pandemic. But we're also excited to celebrate this recently launched book. As of 2 months ago, through UC Press, the Auntie Sewing Squad Guide to Mask Making, Radical Care, and racial justice, which is certainly our effort to not only capture the squad, but to build out and participate in a sort of tradition around Asian American feminisms through a kind of feminist manifesto. So I want to say a few contextual pieces about the book to start us off, but I would be remiss without appreciating the amazing folks at the Eastwind Books and the Oakland Oakland Asian Cultural Center for having us. You all do, such important work to highlight projects like this, but especially Akemi, Jamie, and Erica for all your help in making this happen. We certainly wish we could have been with you all in person, but this transition online has been absolutely seamless. I also want to shout out, and I see so many aunties, I want to shout out our auntie members in tonight's audience on Zoom and elsewhere. The aunties always roll deep. We're not a cult, but the aunties are who got me through the worst parts of 2020 and 2021. So let me just share a little bit about the squad to situate our conversation today, as well as the book. So for those who don't know, the Auntie Sewing Squad is what's called a mutual aid organization. It formed in March 2020 at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which feels like forever ago, but fairly recent, right? It formed in response to the failures of the US government to not only provide personal protective equipment, for example, in the form of masks, but also to prevent harm. In its height, the squad had over 800 members across the country, members who are of all genders, of all ages, and who use the familial term auntie, but also uncle and aunties. We came together to sew cloth masks, but participation and contribution to the organization was not limited to sewing. We have many roles. I myself was a cutter in the organization, and I still actually don't know how to sew. I apologize. Many of us responded to a post on Facebook, either that Kristina Wong had, for example, put up, or that friends of friends had sort of made in terms of a request to really support and join this vibrant effort. The organization, and I still don't believe this number, made over 350,000 masks. And I'm profoundly touched by that amount. But as I say that, I want to say that the organization strove to center communities and people first over sort of capitalist notions of efficiency, for example, or even the idea of buying and selling masks. And that's something that we can talk about more. But I just want to add that the organization primarily sought to meet a need, right, in terms of who it distributed its masks to, especially in terms of communities who are made vulnerable, either in, who are in areas of high transmission of the virus, who had less support, folks who are called essential workers, farm workers, incarcerated folks, asylees and refugees at the border, indigenous nations, just to name a few. And I think many of us can think about, like I said just a bit earlier, that, when we joined the organization, in and of itself, folks think a lot about Kristina Wong, right? A performance artist by day, and someone who became a sweatshop overlord by pandemic crisis. She famously grabbed her Hello Kitty sewing machine to sew a few masks in that initial moment in March 2020. And she said she had materials that she had hoarded from her own sets and costumes for her performance pieces, right? And she initially offered masks to friends who are immunosuppressed. However, she posted on Facebook about offering masks, and she got an overwhelming set of requests, and her friends told her, well, you need a squad of aunties, and so became this operation that we also call a shadow FEMA. I just want to say that the Auntie Sewing Squad draws from what we call traditions of Asian American and women of color feminisms, as well as mutual aid and as well as radical care. No, I'm not just trying to reread the title of the book to you, but that's really what we tried to capture in terms of the spirit of the book and what we want to talk to you all about today. I also want to say that, it certainly feels odd to come together in celebration in a moment when over 880,000 people have died from COVID-19 in the US to date. It's a haunting and jarring number. The fact that masking itself is still a polemical issue, and that variants and subvariants continue to circulate and disproportionately and unevenly affect communities of color, I think all pulls at our own heartstrings. And so I think it's, organizations and projects like this that, draw from these traditions that continue to give me that hope. So for that reason, I hope that this conversation will continue to offer those types of insights as, this book and this conversation will document the squad's work. So that being said, I'm going to transition and turn it over to my colleague and co-editor, Chrissy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Preeti. And hello, everyone. Thank you all for attending our talk today. I'm going to do a short discussion of the format for the next 45 minutes. And then I will introduce our amazing aunties that will be presenting today. For the next 20 to 30 minutes, we have three amazing aunties who will be presenting about their role in the squad, as well as presenting on their contribution to our book and or a project that they're working on the Auntie Sewing Squad. And then for the last 15 to 20 minutes, we will have the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type it into the chat, and then we will ask them at the end after the aunties spoke. Okay, so we have three amazing auntie speakers for you today, and I will be introducing them as they speak. So our first speaker is Valerie So. Valerie So's experimental videos, installations, and documentary films have exhibited worldwide. Her most recent film, Love Boat Taiwan, premiered in 2019 and has won awards and exhibited at sold-out screenings at film festivals around the world. So is the author of the blog BeyondAsiaPhilia.com, which has been funded and awarded by 2012 Art Writers Grant, Creative Capital / Andy Warhol Foundation. And it looks at Asian American art, film, culture, and activism. Her essays and articles have been published in books and journals, including entitled Countervisions, Asian American Film Criticism, After Image, Asian Film, and AmerAsia Journal, among others. She is professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. Now, Auntie Valerie So will speak.
Hi. I just had to close the door because my dog is barking. Thank you so much for the nice introduction. And I do want to add also that I think you can still hear the dog barking. I was one of the sort of middling aunties. I managed to sew almost 700 masks in the months and months that we were sewing masks. But I do know that there were some aunties that sewed something like 10,000 masks. So I was definitely not, I was a worker bee. I wasn't a queen bee, let's just say that. So I'm going to show you a film that I made, a short film that we made, the aunties made last, oh my gosh, it was almost 2 summers ago now. We started making it around June 2020 when Kronos Quartet, the chamber music, experimental music quartet, contacted the aunties and said, we would like to do some kind of collaborative project with you guys. So what they did was that they sent me a piece of music and then asked me to edit clips together to go with the music about the aunties. So the process that I used was, since we were all still pretty much in lockdown at that time, is that I had the aunties send me their clips that they shot themselves on their phones, on their DSLRs, whatever way they could do it, or recording audio clips. And then I had them, just send it to me on WeTransfer or whatever. I downloaded them and then I edited them all together. And so it was really great. The outpouring of images and support was amazing. So you'll hear many, many different aunties speaking about their experiences.
Thank you, Auntie Valerie. So our second speaker is Auntie Sylvia Kwan. Sylvia Kwan is a researcher, evaluator, and consultant who has worked in education for over 3 decades. Originally from the Midwest, she is astonished daily to find herself living with her 2 children, dog, and partner in a flat-roofed ranch-style home on the West Coast. Please welcome Sylvia Kwan.
Hi. I joined AS. Let me go back. So we, many of the aunties and uncles and aunties refer to the Auntie Sewing Squad as AS, and I think that is it speaks a lot to our maybe some of our twisted sense of humor and gallows humor. But I joined AS on March 31st, so fairly early in the pandemic. And I think actually Auntie Grace, you had just added me to the Facebook group and I accepted. And I think that's how a lot of aunties ended up joining through Grace, who isn't here with us today. And I was one of the lucky aunties because I had access to a regular supply of fabric. And, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, getting fabric was very difficult. People were using bed sheets, clothing, anything they could find. And I was fortunate to have a neighbor who is a member of a Unitarian quilting group. She offered her fabric on the condition that I would make a mask for another neighbor of ours who was a nurse for Planned Parenthood at the time. So like many people, I went to YouTube to figure out how to make masks. I had a sewing machine, but my skills were very limited to hemming curtains and making very, very simple Halloween costumes. So, you know, after I managed to make a couple of masks for my neighbor and members of my family, I kind of plunged headfirst into filling mask requests. And if you'll recall, in the early days, a lot of those masks that were made were, you know, primarily for medical workers. That was our main communities that we were trying to support. And so my next request was 30 masks for a friend of mine who works at a local hospital. And I was lucky again because my neighbor, she seemed to have this kind of unlimited supply of fabric. And so I was able to use her fabric to make masks. And some of the Unitarian quilters were also interested in helping out, but they didn't want to join our cult, which I really think there's a certain level of cultishness among us. And we have this wonderful leader in Kristina Wong. So my neighbor and I created this system where I would email her about upcoming requests, and then she would send out an e-newsletter to the other Unitarian quilters. And I was always very impressed by how organized they were and how so receptive they really were and giving up their time. So even though I had a really easy supply of fabric, like a lot of people out there, elastic was very hard to find. And my favorite post of all time was from an auntie who asked if maybe she should repurpose the elastic waistband from her kids' old underwear. And what I love is she even posted a picture as an example. And that to me really captures us in all kind of the resourcefulness, the kindness, and again, twisted glory that we all really cherished. So for me, instead of using elastic, I use long strips from old cotton t-shirts. And luckily I had assistants in my house, which were my children. And, you know, after school, online school and online work ended, we would make masks. And one kid was more willing to help than the other, I think, which is often the case with kids. But, you know, they were interested in it and really did want to help as much as they could. And so when the call came out about contributing to the book, I wanted to write about what compelled me to join and ask and make masks. And for me, joining AS was really an experience of reciprocal care. Masks helped me feel like I was contributing in a very, very small way to flattening the curve. And and also letting the communities that we sewed masks for know that they are valued. And so the request that stays with me the most is the one organized by Grace Yu for incarcerated folks at San Quentin, and that's in my background. Those are the masks that I made. And sewing these masks made me so grateful to be part of AS. And I often thought about Chosu Lee, who was incarcerated at San Quentin, and his case became impetus for a national pan-ethnic Asian American social movement, which led to his release in 1983. And it was, so it was just really meaningful. It just felt like something that was part of this continuous care to communities that I care about and feel very invested in. And if you're interested, there is a documentary called Free Chosu Lee by Julie Ha and Eugene Yi, which just premiered a week ago at Sundance Film Festival. So if you have a chance, please go and see that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sylvia. Our third and final speaker is my co-editor, Maelyn K Hong. Maelyn K Hong is Assistant Professor of Literature at the University of California, Merced. Her research on refugee storytelling, race, and human rights has appeared in Asia, Verge, Melis, Law, Culture, and the Humanities, and other journals and edited volumes. From 2017 to 2021, she has served as co-chair of the Circle for Asian American Literary Studies. Please welcome Maelyn K Hong.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Chrissy. And thanks so much to Eastwind and the Oakland Asian Cultural Center. I'm really moved to be able to be part of an event with these two amazing organizations that have just played a great role in Asian American cultural life. So as an Asian American literature professor, it means a lot. So I am a sewing auntie, as well as one of the co-editors of the Auntie Sewing Squad book. And I'll just tell you a little bit about my experience with the squad, and then a little bit about the book as a project. So I was living in a small town in central Pennsylvania at the beginning of the pandemic. And the way I explain it to people is it was a town of 6,000 people, and it was the part of Pennsylvania that elected Trump. So there were some complicated politics at the time. And for myself as an Asian American woman living there, you know, the sense of disconnection was already there even prior to the lockdown in some ways. So when the pandemic started, I started sewing masks. I learned to sew as a child. I actually don't remember learning to sew because I learned you know, at such a young age from my mother. My family's Vietnamese refugees came to the United States when I was a baby, and I've learned all kinds of skills from my very resourceful parents. But I started sewing masks, and I put them in a box on my front porch, figuring, you know, in a town this small, you can really make an impact just giving away masks. And it was actually amazing. In Pennsylvania, the lockdown was really strict. Only life-sustaining businesses could be open. And so, you know, almost no businesses qualified for that. My son, who was 3 at the time, was home because daycare centers were closed. It was very hard for me to do my work and like my job because I was engaged with caring for my son full time, but I was able to sew. Like that was something that you can do and be interrupted a lot of times if you're just sewing, you know, the same mask over and over again, essentially. But I put these masks in the box on the front porch, and hundreds of people came and took masks and started leaving thank you gifts. And this just was an amazing way to connect with the community. I got all kinds of things. I mean, people would leave fabric and supplies, which was fantastic. They left thank you notes. I got flowers. I got a roll of toilet paper at one point, which I thought was like a really wonderful and sincere thank you gift because if you remember at that time, it was very difficult to buy toilet paper. But in any case, that went on for a few weeks, and I was in touch with my friend and colleague, Chrissy Lau, who brought me into the Auntie Sewing Squad. And at that time, I think most of the members were based in California. It eventually became a nationwide group. And I now live in California, but at the time I was sort of an East Coast branch. And I, right away felt that it was a group whose sensibility and whose politics matched mine. It was hard in some ways to be in a small town in a conservative part of Pennsylvania during the Trump administration. And so the connection that I found through the group was really important to me. At a certain point, I was just sewing full time. I eventually sewed about 4,000 masks over the period of the pandemic. I mean, now we really should be using N95s and KN95s. But at the time, cloth masks were, that's what everybody needed. So it was around June or so of 2020 that the idea of a book project came about. And we were very, very fortunate early on in the conversations with Kristina Wong, with Rebecca Solnit, who's a famed historian writer who's in the group, and Auntie Valerie and some others. So the co-editors, my two co-editors and I were just really fortunate to be able to conceive of this project as a women of color feminist project from the beginning. And we were really happy and thankful that the University of California Press has been extremely supportive of that vision, that they knew from the start that this was essentially a women of color feminist manifesto, and that it was angry and it was critical, in addition to being a collection of creative writing, art, recipes, mask patterns, all of these things, that it was going to be a really unique collection because it was going to contain our grief, our rage, the experiences that we were living through at the time. And so for the second half of 2020, Chrissy, Preeti, and I were working really intensively and fast with dozens of aunties to put together this anthology that we're very proud of, but that is also, like I said, contains a lot of grief, a lot of rage, and in some ways is even looking back at it now, like reading some of it now can be very moving, very emotional. So, the way the book is structured, there are 5 main essays, and then they're in 5 sections, and then each section also has artistic work, creative writing, recipes, and so on. But the essays are kind of the critical core of the book and offer historical, social, and political context, as well as more detailed stories of the aunties who wrote essays. So Chrissy, Preeti, and I each contributed an essay. And so I'll wrap up by just telling you a little bit about my essay, which was called Sewing as Refuge, in the section called Survival. So for a long time, I've sewn as just a hobby and as a mindfulness practice. Like, it's a very calming activity for me. And having gone through some stressful times in my life, as most people have, I have found sewing to be a really valuable activity for me personally. But I had not, up until that point, I had not really connected it with my scholarship. So I'm a literary scholar. I work in Asian American studies. I work on refugee literature. The work is very much inspired by and connected to my family history, coming from a Vietnamese refugee family. But having this, having the connection with the Auntie Sewing Squad and having the chance to really focus just on sewing for a long time, I had time to think about the ways that my parents as refugees had given me the craft of sewing, and how much that meant. And interestingly, one of the main mask patterns that we use in the group was designed by Uncle Van Nguyen, who was a member of the squad. And I knew from his name that he was Vietnamese, and I was curious what his story was. And so we did eventually get to meet over Zoom, and through conversations with Van, I really started to think hard about what it meant for us as refugees to be engaged in mutual aid this way. Van Nguyen has an amazing and really wrenching life story. He was quite unjustly incarcerated from the age of 16 for about 25 years, and had just been released due to juvenile justice reforms, thankfully, about a year before the pandemic began. And so his work sewing as mutual aid in the group was a continuation of community organizing and service work that he had been doing during his incarceration and afterwards. And so just learning about his story and the ways that both of our lives have been shaped by war and trauma and migration, and by a whole continuum of social forces, gave me a chance to really think critically about what it meant for each of us to be sewing during a pandemic that was disproportionately affecting communities of color, incarcerated people, and many other vulnerable communities. So I'm just going to read a brief passage from the book, and then we can have some Q&A time. And I'd love to hear from you all. I see there are a lot of aunties in the audience too, so I think that'll be fun. So this is just a section of my essay. All Vietnamese Americans, if they are not tailors themselves, know people who sew. My mother taught me to sew, knit, and crochet when I was very young. The muscle and sensory memories of sewing formed so long ago that I don't remember learning. What I know is in my body. When sewing by hand, the tautness of deft, repeated movements, a calloused finger, or more often, the clamoring vibration of a metal-framed machine. I register with calm watchfulness the multitude of beautiful, even stitches shot out in the needle's hammering wake. A gentle press of the heel of my hand keeps the fabric in line. Sewing familiar items, my movements are nearly automatic, though some attention is required for precise stitching. Practicing this skill my mother transmitted to me, I thought of all the things my parents had learned to do for themselves. Always enterprising, but never secure, they ran multiple small businesses throughout my childhood. There was the lawn care business, the vending machines, the office cleaning franchise, all of these in addition to their full-time jobs. As I sewed, I remembered my mother's story of how she had cooked and sold street food in the refugee camps in Thailand and the Philippines. She must have been pregnant with my brother at that time, working, always working for our survival. Her hands are never still. How lucky I am to sew by choice. How blessed by my parents' industry, their repetitive stress injuries, their exhaustion and loneliness in those early years in America. Huyn's family sews too, his mother, sister, and brother. During the pandemic, they have been making masks. Early in the pandemic, Huyn worked remotely from his parents' house, where he alternated for long hours between his jobs and volunteer mask making. His mother, a tailor, asked about his sewing and soon joined him in the endeavor. Often, Huyn cuts fabric and sews alongside his mother. They sit side by side. Speaking is unnecessary, as their work is before them, and anyway, their relationship was never that smooth while Huyn was growing up. Talking could take them veering down rocky paths. And his Vietnamese was childish, like mine. Along with many others from the 1.5 generation of Vietnamese Americans, those who came to the United States as young children, we never learned the language formally and have large gaps in our vocabulary. But here, now, both Huyn and his mother are content, at peace, working mostly in silence. Sewing together is very healing, says Huyn, as he recounts how, in an unguarded moment, his mother began to sing. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Maelyn, Sylvia, and Valerie for your comments to give us that kind of depth and insight about the Auntie Sewing Squad and the book itself. Chrissy and I are going to now transition us to moderate some of the Q&A. I have a question to get us started, but I'd love to take this time to remind folks that we would absolutely love to hear from you, especially our aunties and our non-aunties in the audience, about any questions you have, either through the chat or again, the kind of raise hand function through Zoom. But the question that I have to kind of get us started, follows a thread around work and the number of masks that you all sort of mentioned, either now or in your pieces directly. And I'm also just thinking about how your contributions are, pieces that speak to just different themes in the sections of the book, right? Whether it's the survival piece, the piece around posterity and generations, or even just notions of care. And I'm also just struck by, again, how impressive that folks did the work of mask making while also, carrying on other work and non-work identities. So, I was wondering if you could talk about, some of the, like how the work of the squad and your contribution to the book fit into your work as a scholar, an artist, or an organizer. And then I know that Sylvia, in your piece, you actually say that you refuse to count the number of masks because you'd have to then contend with what it meant. And Maelyn, your piece actually catalogs, through a kind of numbering. And Valerie, your piece has the sort of stacks of masks. And so all of that just makes me think of work. So again, if you could sort of talk a little bit about that process of work and, balancing these various work and non-work identities.
I'm happy to start. Thank you, Preeti. I think for each of us who were academics during this period, there were certain things that we were going through, like trying to figure out how to teach remotely and figure out how to write with small children at home and so on. And so those were some challenging and distinctive just characteristics of that period. But the period was also one that being home gave me a lot of time to think. And the thinking was interrupted a lot, but nevertheless, I really was able to think hard about like what it meant for me as a scholar of refugee literature and of refugees to value refugee knowledge as a scholar, but not really contend personally and in an intellectual context with the craft of sewing. So many Vietnamese families sew. I don't know why that is actually, like I'm really curious to know more about that, but like pretty much all Vietnamese people I know, like someone in their family sews. But the kinds of knowledge that register in the academy aren't always the kinds that are concrete in that way and that have so directly to do with survival and just the kinds of resourcefulness that you need to make it through migration, through poverty, through trauma. And so like really thinking hard about like the craft of sewing and how that connected to all of the forms of knowledge. My parents, I'm the first in my family to go to college, and I'm not sure that they'll ever read my writing, like my scholarship, right? And I'm not sure how many members of my family know what I do as a professor, really. But this is a form of knowledge that they gave me, and so that has meant a lot.
Valerie or Sylvia?
I think for me, I also had time to think, maybe too much, because then my anxieties started to take over. So I think what happened then was by sewing masks and thinking about other people, helping other people, there's a mechanism where you stop thinking about your own problems. And it was also really great to have a community at that time when we were so physically isolated. The Facebook page was really, really active all the time. And we became friends, literally friends on Facebook. When I finally got to meet some of the aunties in person, it was almost like I was meeting characters from a book. That's how well I knew them and their quirks and their personalities. So it was quite something. I remember at one of the events, I met an auntie and I would try to guess who they were. Like they would give me a hint, like I'm the person who brought the jars of soup to people. I'm the person who really liked this color, or I'm the person who wanted to, get elastic for my son's underwear. And so then it was kind of a fun thing because I was able to guess a lot of people. So we really got to know each other really quite intimately through the group. And then it was nice because we felt like like any organization or organizing, when you're working together towards a common goal that helps other people, it's really quite liberating. It's really wonderful. Yeah.
Auntie Sylvia, I would love to invite you to share about that as well.
I would say that it was a stubbornness on my part not to count, but I knew, for various reasons, some kind of number would help in terms of the Auntie Sewing Squad getting more kind of being able to, on their website or in news and media outlets, being able to give a number. That's always kind of how many did you make? And that's often the question I get when people find out I was sewing masks. And it, I think somewhere around 1,000, but also that number just means so much more than just a number. It's a number of people who required masks, a number of people who, really needed our support and help, and the number of people who maybe didn't necessarily get the masks, we weren't able to send them masks in time. It's a very loaded kind of quantity or amount for me.
I think for me, the total number that the group sent out is more important than the individual numbers in some way, because you really think about how many of those people, how many lives did we protect or save? And I think, we mentioned in the chat at that time, it was cloth masks or nothing. There were no surgical masks. There were no KN95s you could get. You couldn't get any of that stuff because the government had fucked up. Oh, I'm sorry. The government had not done well in protecting people, intentionally or not. And so the fact that we were able to step in and say something and do something positive, proactive about it, and really try to help out other people, I think was super important. So yeah, the group number to me is important. Individual number, it's fun to keep track, but again, it's not so critical, right? Like Auntie Sylvia said.
About the numbers, throughout that period, and still right now, we watch the death toll rise every day. And Preeti, I really appreciated what you said earlier about, like, it seems like there's something really strange and unsettling about celebrating a book project when the pandemic is raging still. And I'm sure, like, we're at 800 something thousand, which means that in the near future, we're going to surpass 1 million deaths. Like, that will happen. And so for me, the number of masks was, there was like a psychological aspect to it, that there was something else we could count.
One of the aunties, Auntie Badly Licked Bear, wanted me to point out that today we just gave more masks. I think we gave some hundreds of masks to another group. So the work still continues, even though we're officially retired. There are some aunties who are definitely still making masks and contributing, because, we're not out of this pandemic at all. We're not done. So, yeah.
So speaking of getting us through the pandemic, my students at CSUMB were able to conduct oral histories with all of the 3 aunties here, and even with some of the aunties in the audience. And I want to do a shout out to Auntie Wendy Babel. one of my students did an oral history with her, and she actually pointed out something interesting, which was that one thing that really made us different as a sewing group from all the other sewing collectives was the role of dark humor. And dark humor really got us through as a group through the pandemic. And dark humor is in large part attributed to the sweatshop overlord and the organizer of the Auntie Sewing Squad, Kristina Wong, who is a performance artist, and her life's work is based in dark humor. So I would love to put out a question to all of you in terms of how do you see the role of dark humor playing in our group? And how important was it, especially also to infuse it in the book, the film, your contribution, and in general, your thoughts on the role of dark humor?
I mean, I guess you kind of laugh to keep from crying, right? It was such a horrible time, and it still continues to be a horrible time. So to have folks who were able to lighten our day a little bit, led by Christina's macabre sense of humor, I think. One of her favorite things she used to say was that if we didn't sew enough masks, she would chop our fingers off. Right. It was like, who would put up with that except in this horrible moment that we're in where there's like so many people dying, you can't do anything. So you have to kind of like make a joke out of it. So, yeah. I mean, the fact that she's an overlord, like that's okay. We don't even need to talk about that. That's a whole another thing. Yeah. But it was helpful.
And the joke takes on a life of itself. It's also performed in your film, Radical Care. There's a section where the aunties do that cutting notion.
Yeah, that little dance part was choreographed by the aunties themselves. And so Laura Carlin asked people what gestures they wanted to put in, and that was one of them. It's like, oh, we had to put in the finger cutting part.
I don't know if I'm able to share screen or not. I was actually just flipping through photos and trying to find a photo of the time Christina sent me a huge roll of elastic. And there's a little note from her that says, sew every inch of this elastic or I cut off fingers. XO, Christina. And that was just the kind of, I don't know, like there was an urgency to the sewing, we all felt it. And to have some other outlet other than just like anxiety and grief and, like we had to have some way to be together and to just, deal with the absurdity of the situation we were in.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, maybe on another note, some of the stuff was referring back to also histories of people of color in this country who have been oppressed through their work situations. One of the jokes was that we use child labor, right? Like little kids clipping threads and things. But there's definitely been child labor globally as well as in the United States that have been used in the manufacturing of our clothes that we wear in the developed world. So it's definitely something to think about. How can we draw attention to a lot of these issues? Maybe, in a humorous way, but also in a serious way. So, yeah. Oh, there's a good question in the chat here about being Asian American. Yeah, for sure. Because, that whole anti-Asian violence thing, the China virus, I almost cursed again, the China virus rhetoric that the former president was espousing was extremely damaging to Asian Americans. And so I think that it was sure a way to push back against that. Not saying that, oh yeah, we're, these virtuous Asian Americans who are helping out the country. But at the same time, I think maybe just not necessarily, we're not also not villains or perpetual foreigners that the former administration wanted to portray us as.
Yeah, I'm happy to read that question out. I just wasn't sure if everyone was going to answer the previous question up, but we do have a question from one of our viewers, and this kind of speaks to how the organization in of itself is Asian American led, but also constituted by women of color, and like really situated itself in different forms of cross-racial solidarity. But how important is it to us, the panelists, that Asian Americans sort of helped complete strangers, be publicized nationally, in terms of the kind of viral anti-Asian sentiment, but also thinking about sort of like other aspects of racial logics operating at the time.
I think that's a fantastic question. And also thinking of the shadow FEMA organization being primarily led by Asian, API, it's something that kind of turns the notion of organizing and providing support and mutual aid and service to others, I think is just so perplexing in some ways, but also, at least for me, makes sense that, of course, who else would organize and do this work and get shit done? Women of color. So it's not all that surprising, the level of organizing and work and that the squad was able to provide.
Yeah, and I mean, I think working collectively too, the fact that there were so many of us who were speaking out and working together was another way to push back against the former administration and the horrible person who was the president.
I think it's really important that we choose our solidarities, right? Like during this period, we chose to sew for the most vulnerable communities and the ones that really didn't have access. And those, the recipient organizations were vetted very carefully because we specifically wanted the masks to go to organizations that didn't have access otherwise. And it happened, not surprisingly, that these were almost entirely Indigenous communities and communities of color. And often they were communities that had been criminalized, incarcerated people, sex workers, et cetera. So there's something, in the question about, is it important to us that the actions be publicized? I guess that's a complicated question for me, because I also want to push back a little bit on the model minority narrative that Asian Americans should be appreciated because we do good things, or that we behave a certain way, and therefore that we need a certain kind of publicity. I really want to push back on that, because I think part of what made the Auntie Sewing Squad different and kind of unique and really special for some of us is we didn't ask recipients, are you good people according to whatever metrics we just cared that every human deserved to be cared for, and that's it. And so I think part of our experience was that with the rise in harassment and violence against Asian Americans, I think that was a really trenchant part of our pandemic experience and really frightening for many of us, especially women, and culminating in the Atlanta spa shootings last year. And we sewed through all of that. But I don't want the narrative to be that look at the good we did, therefore we shouldn't be harassed, right?
Absolutely. It reminds me so much of just the conversation around mutual aid and, the adage that's sort of associated with it, solidarity, not charity, right? So the sense that, the mutual aid work is not about, strings being attached, but about a kind of structural change. So, yeah. I certainly have many more questions to ask, but I also want to be mindful of time. I think there is a question about just the fact that the Auntie Sewing Squad is retired. You know, for so many folks, you know, Auntie Sewing Squad retirement was something that folks looked forward to in terms of a chance to kind of come together, meet in person, and yet, and to officially sort of stop the, you know, volunteer-based care work of mask making. But then I know some folks like Valerie mentioned, Badly Like Bear are continuing with the sort of mask making, you know, following the ongoing need. So I was just wondering if maybe we can close with, you know, how do you all make sense of the pandemic and mutual aid now? And, you know, if Chrissy has an addendum to that, feel free to add to that. But how do you all make sense of this retirement, especially in the pandemic now and mutual aid now? I see faces. I didn't mean to stump anybody, but if you even want to just talk about retirement itself, that would be lovely.
I think that for a lot of us, we were getting very burned out, and we were getting very annoyed that things were not being, you know, it's like it's not our job to pick up the slack of the government. And so I think that was the main thing. It's like we did our part. Now it's your turn. So.
For me, it's complicated just because I did retire, but I also often, you know, the pandemic's not over. So it's a push and pull feeling, like, what else can I do? Are there other ways to provide support? And that's been something that I've been struggling with.
The burnout is really real. So I moved to California last summer, and I have not unpacked my sewing machine yet. And we've, you know, continued to do work related to the book project, and work, you know, that's community building within the Auntie Sewing Squad. We've been speaking to the media. We've been doing, you know, lots of things that are related, but at a certain point, like, this is like, we have to live our lives too, and we have lots of responsibilities, including ones that cropped up because of the pandemic. And so, you know, we tried to fill a gap as best we could.